Hello, comrades. Welcome you all to our latest session in the Revolution series with Kevin Bean. And those of you who've read the Jewish Chronicle will have seen that Kevin, unfortunately, is the latest victim of the witch hunt. He's been expelled under the first part of Rule 214B, which is the part rule dealing with exclusions, but really should be abolished. Like so many rules in the Labour Party rulebook, it bars from Labour Party membership anybody who's involved in another organisation. It's been, of course, exclusively been used against left-wingers. They don't mean people who are involved in Prospect or in any of these other right-wing organisations. It's all directed against the socialist left. Tonight is not about the witch hunt. Tonight is about the French Revolution. Very important subject. I'm not going to say anything more about it, mainly because I don't know that much about it. What I do like about Kevin's introductions, though, is even if you know a little bit about it, that helps to set the context. But Kevin always manages to turn the sort of established historic ideas about a particular subject on its head and gives us a different perspective, which I enjoy very much. So thank you very much, comrade, for joining us again tonight. Off you go.
Okay, thanks very much, Tina. And just before I go on, thanks to all the little messages that have come in the chat box, both for my comrades and other comrades who are facing expulsions and suspensions and so on. Okay, tonight's session is on Babeuf, the Conspiracy of Equals and the French Revolution. And when I was preparing this, I looked at, the number of books that had been written on Babeuf, and indeed the radical, and I might even say communist elements in the French Revolution in English, and found that there were really only about 3 or 4. One of the most recent was by Ian Birchall, and it's a very good book, and I will put it on the reading list. But I was surprised that what I thought was fairly well known and a fairly well covered area, in fact, hasn't been given the attention that it deserves in English. So I hope that tonight's talk, for those comrades who don't know anything about Babeuf, will help them to do some of that reading. I'll also recommend the Marxist Online Archive, which is an excellent archive, which has got lots of material, not only by the obvious Marxists, the well-known ones, but even some Marxists that you haven't heard of, and indeed a lot of good historical material. And there's a lot of good material there by Babeuf and his comrades. So it will be a very good, a very good way to find out more about this topic. So who was Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals, so-called? And really, why is it important in terms of socialist history? Well, I think all comrades know that the French Revolution was in many ways the first modern revolution. And all of us, no matter how far removed in time we are in a sense all descendants of that revolution. Indeed, I would say that all modern politics, all politics in bourgeois and liberal capitalist societies, and indeed in all forms of societies, have some inspiration from the political ideas of that period. We're all, in a way, children of the French Revolution. Even such a simple term of terminology, left and right, which is nowadays just part of everyday political language, is born in the French Revolution. The more radical deputies on the left of the assembly, they're the more conservative ones on the right. And indeed, if we read any of the classic Marxist accounts, particularly Marx, Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and others, refer constantly and use the French Revolution as a sort of treasury of terms. So when Trotsky in the 20s and the 30s is discussing events in the Soviet Union, he refers to the Thermidorian reaction, and Thermidor refers to coup against the Jacobin regime, the Committee of Public Safety, in effect led by Maximilien Robespierre. And so the term Thermidorian, meaning a sort of counter-revolution, has become part of the language. But also other terms, such as the Mountain, again referring to more radical deputies and so on. So not just the sort of the deeper ideas of politics, but indeed our understanding of politics. Indeed, all sorts of forms of political organization, the demonstration, the political newspaper, even the idea of revolution itself, I think, comes from the great French Revolution. And as I've said, Marx and Engels and Lenin in particular all drew from its terminology. So people were working within that framework. So having sort of set that sort of scene, I want to talk about Babeuf and try to locate him within that revolution. Babeuf was a radical communist, and although there's some debate over his ideas, and I will point to some of the problems and some of the issues there, it's very clear when we read his work that he's actually talking about the same sort of problems and the same sort of issues, albeit in a very different language and indeed in a very different situation, to those that confront socialists and have confronted socialists for the last couple of 100 years. In particular, the definitions of class, the nature of an economy, what we even mean by socialism. Babeuf didn't use that idea, and that idea would come later, but it would be developed by people who've been associated with him and indeed were influenced by his ideas. Babeuf used the term common happiness, which does sound rather anemic, but in fact I think has a more militant sound when we explain its origins in the Enlightenment. But also Babeuf is looking at the transition from one form of society to another. How is that going? What are the role of the mass of the population? Could, for example, the transition from a class society, a society of inequality, be achieved democratically? Of necessity, would it be democratic, or would it be carried out by some form of coup? What form of government would exist in the transitional period? How long would the transitional period last? Now, these ideas are developed. They're developed quite theoretically, but they are being discussed and they are being considered. Then when we move on to the forms of politics, the use of the newspaper, even an old favorite of us leftists, the fly poster, was carried out by Babeuf and his comrades. The newspaper that was directed towards the mass of the population, newspapers targeted at different groups, the use of leaflets, the idea of open meetings where comrades could come along and discuss ideas, a very early form of revolutionary organization in which people were given responsibilities in certain areas, in certain districts of Paris, and some comrades were delegated to work in the army, others in particular workplaces, and so on. So there's a lot in this very short-lived movement. But I want to perhaps explain how and why it came into being and where it came from, and indeed its relationship to the French Revolution itself. Babeuf was born in 1760 in the northeastern part of France, in Picardy, and came from a fairly humble background, had, I think, a fairly limited education, but as far as we can tell from his own accounts, it was one of sort of great questioning. He was a voracious reader, and above all, in the society that he grew up in, particularly from the 1780s onwards, there's a tremendous ferment of ideas. And indeed, this ferment of ideas is linked obviously to political changes that will produce the revolution of 1789. what I intend to do for this session is really to summarize this and have some supplementary material in another form, because the French Revolution would deserve several years of courses, I think, and it's very difficult to sort of squeeze it in. But it is very important, I think, to remember the sort of intellectual and political ferment that was going on. This ferment ideologically is linked to a much broader intellectual movement, the Enlightenment. And this is, again, another controversial term. But what we can see in the Europe of the late 18th century, and indeed, I think, as Daniel was talking about last week in terms of the Atlantic Revolution, and looking at this as a series of revolutions across the Atlantic world, we can see this movement challenging the ancien regime, challenging the old forms of society, and in its more radical forms, putting a tremendous emphasis on ideas of popular sovereignty, which may equate to forms of democracy, but above all, an intellectual challenge around ideas of reason, of a critique of tradition, particularly the old order, and above all, the idea of human subjectivity, and I suppose perhaps more importantly, a rejection of authority purely based on tradition. And writers such as Voltaire, and then Rousseau, Diderot, and so on, developed forms of these ideas. Now, some Enlightenment philosophers are more conservative than others, and it's a very sweeping set of generalizations that I've just given. But what's important is the idea of the possibilities of, I think, change, particularly some ideas of progress and the possibilities of progress. And in the case of Rousseau, his idea of natural rights, particularly of the development of repression and tyranny in society, and the possibilities of changing that. Now, of course, those sorts of ideas of popular sovereignty and democracy will remain theoretical, but they start to assume a practical importance in the French Revolution, and in particular the crisis of the French monarchy that emerges following its intervention in the American War of Independence. And one of the interesting paradoxes is that one of the most reactionary monarchies in Europe, for its own powerful interests, intervenes in that revolution on the side of the revolutionaries, and in that way draws itself into massive debt problems. There are economic problems, and this then precipitates a much wider political crisis. Now, Babeuf, as a young man, encounters these ideas in Picardy. He is linked to various academic and cultural circles. So he's actually in touch with some of the most radical ideas of that time. And I suppose this is what makes this French Revolution, and indeed Babeuf, very different from some of the other revolutionaries that we've considered. We've seen revolutionaries. I mean, I began with the Peasants' Revolt, and John Rees and Steve Freeman looked at the Levelers, and we can all see the sort of glimmerings of ideas. But what I think, what we're starting to experience here, and I think also in America, but that was last week, we're starting to see recognizably modern political ideas. We're starting to read books and pamphlets which uses language which we can understand, and indeed, we can feel some connection with. Now, Babeuf is a relatively minor regional figure in the early stages of the revolution. He agitates for change. He supports the radical changes, and indeed, we can see from his letters and so on that he's already been anticipating really quite serious change. For example, the idea of redistribution of land, giving land to the peasants, the destruction of the big estates, the handing over of church property. So he's very much in tune with the politics of that time. But it isn't until he moves to Paris, actually on the run from a rather dubious legal case, that he encounters the great waves of the revolution itself. Now, one of our problems, I think, about understanding the French Revolution is not that it's inherently difficult, but I think it's inherently complex. And it is, I think, a series of different revolutions and different revolutionary forces. I think this question came up in some ways with John's and Steve's work on the levelers earlier. And that is that we might want to see the revolution less as a sort of clear line, but actually as a series of contending forces. It's clearly a bourgeois revolution. It quite dramatically sweeps away large areas of the old order. The monarchy is overthrown. The feudal aristocracy's titles are removed, and indeed, at various stages, we have various forms of political democracy emerging. This involves a number of different stages, and often it would appear to be moving from a more conservative phase in the period of 1789 to 91, through to more radical phases, and then in 1794, some sort of consolidation of the revolution. And I want you to try and think about Babeuf as somebody who is sort of navigating all of this. Unlike Lenin or even Marx, although in many ways Marx was also making sense of his own time, Babeuf didn't have the collected works of Lenin or the collected works of Marx to try and look at and say, this is what happens in a revolution. He did have the experiences of other revolutions, and I'm sure that John Rees and Steve Freeman would be interested to know that in some of his articles he refers to Cromwell and the English Revolution. And of course, he was very well aware of developments in America as well. But he was making sense of what was happening. And I suppose in some senses, he was seeing this revolution unfolding before him, hoping that by some natural dynamics, it would carry itself through and indeed achieve the sort of things that he wanted. Now, he made sense of these processes. He made sense of these processes, and we know what his thinking was because he wrote not only letters and pamphlets, but of course he published newspapers. And this again, I think, shows a very different type of politics than we've seen before. Although again, John Rees made reference to the leveler material in this way. The models that he was influenced by were those of the classical world. He took on the name Gracchus after the plebeian, the leader of the plebeians in the agrarian struggles in the early days of the Roman Republic. And of course, the Roman Republican tradition was one that he could point to. But he also commented on what was happening around him, and in particular, the failure of the radical wing of the bourgeoisie to really carry out a revolution that met the interests of the mass of the propertyless parts of the population. And he subjected the more radical element in the revolution, particularly that of the Jacobin, the Jacobin regime, the Committee of Public Safety under Robespierre, which is often regarded as the extreme left wing of the regime. But of course, there were limits to that radicalism, and although it did carry out measures that were designed to placate the mass of the propertyless, of the small producers, particularly in Paris, there were limits to that. And indeed, the Jacobin, although the most left wing, still upheld the idea of private property, and in particular, their ideal society was one of small property owners rather than any form of socialism. So although we might associate the terror of Robespierre, we might associate that as the most revolutionary part of the French Revolution, in many ways it still held back. It still did not go towards any form of radical socialism or redistribution. It was under pressure to do so. It was under pressure to take measures against property owners, partly because of the economic crisis it found itself in, raging inflation, problems with food supply, and above all, a military intervention by foreign powers. So the new regime, rather like the new Soviet government in 1917 to 1921, 22, is faced with both external enemies, but also internal enemies as well. And so in some ways, it's having to balance in a number of ways. So Babeuf, this radical who's arguing for a regime of equality, of democracy, is incredibly critical of Robespierre. Indeed, when Robespierre's regime is overthrown in the Thermidor coup in July 1794, he welcomes this. And this again often comes as a surprise to people who sort of see the Jacobins as the far left. But the Jacobins were not only not the far left, but in many ways had acted against the interests of many of their own supporters, the so-called sans-culottes. Now, we're in I think at this point it's perhaps useful to try and explain the class structures, because the French Revolution is a bourgeois revolution. It is a revolution which removes the power of the feudal aristocracy, opens the way for commercial and industrial development. And it's a bourgeois democratic revolution in the classic sense. It declares democracy, it declares the rights of man and the citizen, and it contains within it some of the most radical demands for democracy in history. And in the Jacobin Constitution of 1793, it theoretically upholds manhood suffrage and indeed ideas of the sovereignty of the people. But the class formation, I think, is problematic. The sans-culottes, a collective term meaning the plebeians, is a very portmanteau term, and we can't identify the sans-culottes with the proletariat, with the working class, with simply wage workers of the sort that will develop in industrial societies, or that were developing in industrial societies such as Britain at that time. We can certainly see that these were often, they were wage workers, but some were also small property owners. And they would perhaps identify themselves with a pre-class formation of being the people, against the elite. So, in that way, Babeuf is trying to navigate class formations and trying to look at politics, I suppose, using terms which are not yet fully formed. And of course, the problem is that the society that he's operating in, the proletariat is a very weak force. That isn't to say that there isn't a proletariat. There's industry, and indeed, particularly in Paris, in areas like textiles and so on, this is quite a significant feature. But that class is relatively young. And so in the great events, the great journée of the French Revolution, the crowds who storm the Bastille, the crowds who attack the Hôtel de Ville, the people who put pressure on the bourgeois, who put pressure on the various governments, who really forced the pressure for the trial and execution of the king. These are much less a working class, and I suppose in sections of them a pre-working class, but many of them would be small property owners. And it's this ideal, this idealization of the sans-culotte, which determines or shows up the nature of Jacobin politics. Now, Babeuf actually is involved in the administration of the food distribution system in Paris during the Jacobin regime, and he has plenty of experience of these problems. And I think it's this which in some senses radicalizes him. And in particular, an understanding that simply establishing price controls and simply leaving private property in place is not going to achieve the democratic goals of the revolution. So what happens increasingly following the fall of the Jacobin government and the Thermidorian period is that Babeuf moves increasingly to the left. He spends a considerable amount of time in prison, again as a follow-up to an unrelated legal case. But whilst in prison, he meets other radicals, in particular Buonarroti, who will later write an account of this period, where the conspiracy of equals, and will bring together many of the documents which give us such excellent information and sources for this period. Whilst he's in prison in 1796, he begins to formulate a program. And when he's released, it's a very short period between October and the spring of 1796, he begins to develop a political organization. And this political organization is referred to as the Secret Directory. Essentially, it's a group of, I think it would be correct to call them communists, who want to change society. They vary from those who are still hankering for the Jacobin period. And indeed, partly as a concession to this, Babeuf suggests that one of the demands would be to reinstate the 1793 constitution. But other demands are very clearly for a set of social transformations which we could now clearly recognize as socialist. So, for example, if we just look at in one of their manifestos, they argue for the following. This was in their draft economic decree, and it was the decree they were going to institute if their revolutionary movement had been successful. I don't know about you, comrades, but I think this is probably much better than Labour's 2019 manifesto. They call for healthy, comfortable and decently furnished accommodation, clothing for work and leisure in wool or yarn in accordance with the national costume. Possibly that's not that good, but laundry, lighting and heating, a sufficient quantity of food, bread, meat, poultry, fish, eggs, butter or oil, and there's also wine in there as well, and medical assistance. In other words, they're putting forward a fairly sort of clear set of economic demands. So this is not just a set of abstractions, and in many senses, they're dealing with the very concrete problems that the Parisian population had faced. Again, following the overthrow of the Jacobins, the Thermidorian regime was moving considerably to the right, a great deal of repression, and inevitably that fell on the urban poor in Paris. So the conspiracy of equals, so-called, that's Buonarroti's term, but secret directory, began to plan to build a movement. They institute a very imaginative form of organization. They had comrades essentially in the different districts who would then report to the directory, above all, looking at what Babeuf refers to as the thermometer of popular opinion. They wanted to gauge support And they were consciously trying to build support, as I mentioned, particularly in the army, particularly in workplaces. And they did this, in a variety of ways, putting up posters, having street meetings. The one that the use of newspapers, the Tribune of the People, and so on. One of the methods I quite like is the use of songs. They put their revolutionary demands into songs, and indeed had sort of musical evenings. They had singers in the various pubs and clubs and so on, singing revolutionary songs. Indeed, when they were put on trial at the end of each session, until this was prevented, they would end the session of the trial by the prisoners, 40 plus of them in the box, as it were, singing a revolutionary song in unison. Again, I think a very inspiring pattern. Now, this movement was building up. There'd already been signs. That that there was unrest, and indeed there were some mutinies. There were some signs that in the forces of the state, that soldiers and others were discontented, and indeed there were various strikes and other protests. But no real attempt was made to organize an insurrection. It was still very much at the planning stage. But the state officials placed an informer in their ranks, found out essentially what was going on, and arrested them all. They were arrested in May 1796, and then were put on trial. Now, what's interesting about the trial, which itself became very much a public affair, was that both sides used it as a platform. The state wanted to warn the bourgeoisie that if it did not rally behind the government, and particularly to support the military led by the young and emerging General Bonaparte, then these sorts of radical revolutionaries would take over. On the other hand, the Babeuf and his comrades wanted to use the trial as some sort of platform. And again, very much part of the revolutionary tradition. John Lilburn had done this earlier, as indeed had been many of the Protestant reformers of the Reformation had done the same thing. They'd use accusations thrown at them as a chance to put forward their ideas. So that revolutionary tradition of the accuser being accused by the defendant was most dramatically put forward here. Babeuf was given I think something like 5 days to make his summing up, which makes our sessions look rather puny, I think, in comparison. Although I do know some comrades who would regard 5 days as a bit of a short lead off, as it were. But the trial really did reveal, I think, their aims. Now, tactically, some of the defendants argued that we should play down our aims and actually say there wasn't a conspiracy. Others said, well, look, we've got nothing to lose. We're likely to be executed. We might as well go for broke. And the strategy was, in a sense, sort of half and half. But I think we get enough of the ideas of Babeuf from that trial to understand that clearly he was aiming for quite a significant transformation of society, and that he had very clear ideas about how that might be achieved. The trial was successful for the state. Babeuf was found guilty, but a number of defendants were found guilty, but with extenuating circumstances. In particular, Buonarroti, who would live well into the 1820s and was in a position to write a memoir of these events. The other interesting thing, and this again shows perhaps the development of a bureaucratic tradition, is that the secret directory had a mass of papers and reports when the various agents and delegates from the arrondissement of Paris reported, they made notes of what was said. And so we've also got subscription records of their newspapers and so on. So we're actually able to build up quite a good picture of this movement. So just to sort of round off, why do I think it's important? Well, I've outlined, I think, some of Babeuf's ideas, but listen to a few others. Make the people understand that they will never do anything great, that they will never make revolution for themselves, for their true happiness, except when there are no rulers involved in any way in their movement. They must not be so distrustful of their own resources, and they must convince themselves that they, the people, are sufficient to be able to carry out a great undertaking. Thus, in the one we are preparing, take care to set aside everything which is not of the people. Now that may seem sort of rather spontaneous. It may even have traces of anarchism within it. But I think what the important thing is that it's the working class themselves, it's the urban population that will carry out this revolution. I want to also just sort of conclude by talking about the influence of this movement. In 1919, when the Third International drafted its founding manifesto, they referred there to the long history and the martyrdom of revolutionaries from Babeuf to Rosa Luxemburg. And I think that although very clearly Babeuf is not a scientific socialist, he's not a Marxist, but what he is someone who is, in a sense, reaching towards that future. He is still obviously rooted in his time, but why I think he is a person worth studying is that he is trying to orientate in a new world. And the ideas that he puts forward will go on to influence others. There will be, I think, some quite direct connections between his movement in terms of personnel and so on, his movement and other movements of the early 19th century. And indeed, these will then in turn go on to contribute to the Marxist and the socialist movement of that century. Is he looking back? Is he really a figure who doesn't speak to us? Many of his biographers, and indeed many of the books in the English language, have tended to regard him as a utopian. Well, I mean, he was clearly a utopian in one sense, in that the forces to carry out a proletarian revolution of that sort didn't exist. But there was a proletariat in Paris, and above all, he was working in revolutionary times. He was trying to develop ideas, and above all, he was basing himself on that working class, on those people who could only live by the power of their labor. So in that sense, he looks forward. He looks forward to our time in that way. But obviously he has his limitations, and he doesn't use the language of scientific socialism. He talks about common happiness, which sounds in some ways rather anemic. But of course, happiness as defined in the American Constitution, and indeed in terms of the Enlightenment, in a world in which anything approaching happiness was deemed not only to be impossible, but actually unacceptable for the mass of the population, to call for a humane democratic society, and indeed to organize for that, I think does represent a socialist achievement. And if you read his manifestos, if you read what he and other members of the secret directory were arguing for, then you can clearly see that it's recognizably the politics of the left. So I think, as Isaac Newton said in another context, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think if we're going to look at a giant, then Babeuf is well worth of our attention, and is well worthy of being an inspiration to us in in what isn't, a particularly propitious period for socialists. Well, thank you, comrades.
Wow, Brad. Very good, Kevin. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. Yes, quite. I think, well, obviously, I wasn't aware of Babeuf's role in introducing a lot of what we understand today about what socialism is all about. It sounds like somebody needs to write a book about him, Kevin. Yeah? Need another one. But I think that was a really good introduction, the role the French Revolution played in bringing us revolutionary ideas. And no doubt Marx will have been hugely inspired by that. But I also liked your putting it into context that, without having Marx's collected works or Lenin's collected works on your shelf, it must have been tremendously difficult to try and think through how you can change society in a way where everything is changing, where classes are starting to develop. So that was a fascinating thing. Fascinating opening. Okay, we have got 2 people already indicating. Comrades, if you want to ask a question or make a contribution, please indicate by raising your blue hand or put your question in the Q&A. There are already a few questions. We prefer to bring people in, but I can read out some of the questions later on. I'm bringing first Dave Hill.
Yeah, really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed that, Kevin. Thank you. It's always been one of my heroes, Gracchus Babeuf. What I want is a couple of questions. I love the way you present these things, by the way. Yeah, great. Couple of questions. Did the Babeuf plot have any, and organisation, have any purchase outside Paris? Because there were a couple of other cities at the time which also were developing a nascent proletariat and sans-culottes, of course. So that's the first question. Did it have any purchase in some of the other centres of France? And secondly, was it snuffed out by the decisions of the courts, by the execution, etc., or did it carry on at all? Obviously, the ideas carried on, but were there revolutionaries, as you correctly called them, I think, communist revolutionaries, carrying on for some period after the decapitation of the Babeuf plot?
Kevin, do you want to answer one by one? I thought that worked quite well last week. Up to you. How do you want to do it?
Yeah, okay, we'll give it a try. It's a new way of doing it. It also,
up to you. If it doesn't work, we go back to the old system.
No, it's not that. It also stops me speaking for too long.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Dave, yes, there were movements outside of Paris. We know less about them, and indeed, there's some sort of debate about how sort of well organized they were. Certainly, Lyon, which is a big textile area, but Marseille, Toulon as well, and also up in the north in Babeuf's home area in Picardy, and also towards the Pas-de-Calais and so on, which were actually industrializing. So it was more than just a Parisian movement. Indeed, Ian Burchell, I think, in his account, which is a very good one, so I don't need to write one. He's done it. Well, I think he's done a very good account. He makes the point, though, that unlike, say, the Paris Commune, which was quite Paris-centered, this was a much wider movement. For example, the circulation of the newspapers and other material did extend a bit further in that way. In terms of the future, after the executions in 1797, there were sort of isolated movements, but I think the sort of success of the movement was in some ways predicated on a milieu in Paris and elsewhere that still believed that, say, the Jacobin regime could be restored. And although Babeuf moved far beyond that, and indeed many of his followers did, in 1796-97, you were still near enough to that period, and it was still sufficiently unstable. I think that as the Directory consolidated itself, and particularly Napoleon, and when we move into the consulate and then later the empire, by this period the state has solidified, and indeed we're starting to move into the period of wars of expansion. So in many ways the movement is contained, or it's sort of channeled into other areas. There are isolated plots, and I suppose one of the things is that many of the leading types either sort of retire from politics, or in a few cases even join the new regime. And indeed, in a couple of cases, some of them live on to the Restoration and have become monarchists as well. So I think that Babeuf emerges in a sort of a current. You know, there'd been radical currents under the Jacobins, the Hébertists, the Enragés, and so on. And I think those currents had sort of, in a sense, this was the last gasp of it, because remember that when Babeuf is arrested, although, you know, there is some opposition, the population don't rise in support of him, unlike, say, the early period of the revolution, when in the so-called sort of popular movements that had, you know, often imprinted and forced the revolution to the left, or had intervened in events, that didn't occur. You know, there was an attempt to get some soldiers to you know, mutiny, as it were, and that failed. The soldiers refused to join it. So in a way, I think it becomes a sort of an underground tradition rather than, you know, anything very significant. Even at its height, I think it's more a case of the potential and what it represents, rather than its actual practical power. And I think the arrests show the limitations of it as a movement. I think what is more interesting are the ideas of Babeuf, both on organization, but also, you know, in his various manifestos and so forth. So.
Thank you, Kevin. Zbigniew, please, next.
Yeah, I'm interested in the influence on Britain, and the influence again of Tom Paine on the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. So across the Channel, and then Mary Wollstonecraft from France across the Channel back to Britain. If you could say a bit more about that and how that affected maybe the development of the Chartists or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you need a break, Kevin, or do you want to carry on?
No, I'll carry on.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. Till my voice goes out, anyway. Yes, Zbigniew. There is an influence. In fact, next week I'm going to look at the idea of the French Revolution as the First World Revolution, and I will look at obviously the events in Haiti, but also in a slightly later period, Bolivar in Latin America. And also I will bring in about British radicals, the United Irishmen, the United Scotsmen, the United Englishmen, London Corresponding Society. So yes, there's a lot, you know, there's a lot of influence there, a lot of clear connections in that way. It's interesting that you mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft. I wasn't aware of this, but and it's something I think I'd like to chase up. But there is some reference that she may well have met Babeuf while she was in France. There's a reference in a letter that William Goodwin wrote about the possibility that she'd met him, but it might not be accurate. But you know, that again shows that. I mean, Tom Paine was obviously lived in France, and indeed was a deputy in the National Assembly from Calais. although interestingly, in the French Revolution, he was somewhat on the right. He was Girondin, and in a way that sort of shows the pattern and the progress of the French Revolution, that he would have not been the more radical. But you are right that that radicals in all countries look to France. And why I think, and perhaps I should have said a little more about it being the first modern revolution, was of course that the French revolutionaries, the more radical ones, did actually argue that theirs was the sort of first blow against tyranny, and that they were the friends of liberty in any country. And indeed, when the French armies began to fight back against the counter-revolutionary armies from Prussia and Austria, they launched what they regarded as wars of liberation in the Austrian Netherlands, nowadays Belgium, and also into Western Germany as well. And indeed, you know, later on, when under Napoleon, but again, this is part of this sort of wider impact. Large areas of Western Germany were in the West Bank of the Rhine was actually incorporated into the French Empire, and like many areas of Europe in which the French conquered, they brought with them certain gains from the French Revolution. You know, the ending of feudal obligations, the nationalization of church property, you know, the emancipation of the Jewish population. And Marx's father, who'd obviously been alive as a young man during this period, was one of many people who you know, welcomed the French administration. I suppose when if you want to think of it in terms of years, Marx is only born 3 years, I think it's 3, maybe well, yes, 3, after Napoleon is finally defeated at Waterloo. So if you want to think about the proximity of these events, for those of us in middle age, which isn't me, I'm a bit older than that, but you're really thinking about, say, socialists now thinking about the events of maybe the early 20th century or the 1990s. In other words, these events are very close to the sort of politics which are emerging in early 19th century Europe. You know, most adults will have remembered Napoleon, and will remember the French Revolution. You know, and the names of the French revolutionaries and what was done, we know, will be sort of fresh in the minds of people. And above all, the people it will be fresh in the minds of will be the ruling classes of Europe. When they gather at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the restored monarchy, their foreign minister Talleyrand, the Austrian foreign minister or chancellor Metternich, and of course the British minister Castlereagh, are all determined that the revolution and anything like it's going to be stamped on. So there is, if anything, a counter-revolutionary international, and Marx actually refers to this in the so-called reference to the Holy Alliance at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. So it isn't just Britain that's influenced by this, but Thomas Paine is an important sort of transmitter of it, and indeed, the debates in Britain about the French Revolution, particularly Paine and Burke, you know, are quite significant, and all radicals in Britain will look to France and will see that as a model. You know, even down to the level of calling themselves citizen and cutting their hair short, which again is a sign of being revolutionary and modern, as opposed to the decadent aristocracy and the ruling class.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Steve, please.
Okay. I've unmuted myself now, I think.
Yep.
You're okay, Steve, I can hear you.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much for that. It was excellent talk, and it's put a couple of questions in my mind. So mine is a kind of observation followed by a question. So the observation is thinking about linking it back, I suppose, to the English Revolution, actually, to thinking about this idea of a social republic as opposed to a socialist republic, which I think the idea of the Commonwealth from the English Revolution is an excellent idea to get this idea of a social republic. And the programmatic points that you gave, so obviously it was the idea of democracy in a republic, but it was also the idea of the welfare of the people. So there's a program which the points of the program that you read out there look like the welfare of the people. So you mentioned clothing, leisure, laundry, light, food, medical assistance, and all these other things that to me would mean a social republic in the way that I think that captures it. In other words, it's democracy plus the welfare of the people, which does link to Tom Paine, because you can see in Tom Paine the idea of a social republic, not a socialist republic. Now, if you go back to the Levellers and the Diggers, that was also a time of a social republic, but the Diggers went on to not call for the complete socialization of the land, but they took action to socialize the land. So my question leads me to say that, does the program that you were telling us about, does it go into property ownership? That's the thing that, does it go into land, for example, which seems to be a very, very important question. So there was a property question in the English Revolution. There should be a property question here. And I was thinking, as I was saying this, thinking to myself, whether the slogan bread, land and peace, the one from the Russian Revolution, is a kind of idea of a social republic for Russia. It doesn't abolish capitalism, but it's the idea that by public ownership of land, bread for the people and peace is the idea of a social republic. They're all versions of this idea that goes back to the English Commonwealth. So it's the question, Kevin, I don't know, is what property aspects did Babeuf, if any, did he take up? Because you didn't really mention that in you describing his program, and maybe because it wasn't there, or maybe because you hadn't, you just included it. So it's about property. Yeah, what they said about property.
Yeah, no, I think you're. I think you've hit on an important question. It is it's a difficult one. That's not a way of sort of avoiding it. The issue of land was discussed, and indeed Babeuf had written about it before the French Revolution proper, and indeed because he came from Picardy, which was still overwhelmingly rural, as indeed most of France was, issues of common land and indeed land ownership, rents and all the rest of it were important issues to him. What he rejected was the idea of an agrarian law. There were, again, this goes back to Gracchus and the Gracchi and the plebeian movement in the Roman Republic. He rejected the idea of a sort of equal redistribution of land. In other words, everybody gets 11 acres. I think he actually talked about 11 acres, not 10 acres and a cow, or whatever the phrase was in this country. 5 acres, I think. But he seems to have rejected that as in some ways being impractical, and indeed is talking about some form of sort of common ownership. Now the problem with this is that it's I think largely contained in fragments and in letters, and so there's nothing, as far as I'm aware, of a movement of equivalent to the Russian peasant movement. Remember that what had happened to the estates was that the monastic ones had been nationalized, there'd been some redistribution, some peasant land had been consolidated, but there was still a large number of wage laborers and indeed rather marginal farmers who subsisted on common land and so on. I suppose what we might have referred to as cotters and people of that sort. I think he's going beyond the ideas of the sort of sturdy yeoman, and in particular the sort of Jacobin idea of the family as an economic unit. And he's talking about some form of collective. I'm loath to use the word collective farm, but there are some phrases which talk about that. Where he's clearly, in terms of property ownership, where he's clearly at his most communistic is actually in reference to industry and the property in the city. And there's a phrase here which I sort of picked out, which I thought was actually quite you know, in a sense, quite prescient, if I can find it. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, Steve.
No problem.
And this is actually about industry, but also about, in a sense, a sort of planned economy almost. He says, it is only in a system of community that the use of machines would be a true advantage for humanity, whose labours they would lessen while increasing the abundance of necessary and agreeable things. Today, by suppressing a great quantity of manual labour, they take the bread out of the mouths of a mass of men in the interest of a few greedy speculators whose profits they increase. So, I mean, that's what, I mean, that's, you know, is clearly different from, you know, modern socialistic demand, but it's also clearly different from the sort of peasant proprietor, or indeed the sort of small family business, or the, you know, the journeyman artisan production that say the, you know, the Jacobins upheld. So I think that this is quite communistic, and I think although I think that there are some sort of loose ends, and I as I've said, he's working within the limits of his time, but it's very clear that he rejects, you know, some of those aspects, and I think he is moving towards some sort of collective ideas. So I think the thing, I mean, what would probably help is probably you know, looking sort of extensively at the material. I mean, much of it, of course, is in French, and there's quite a massive amount which has not been translated into English. And you know, the material on the Marxist online archive is, you know, is good, but it's limited in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Kevin, Tony, please. I muted you when you blew your nose, so you have to unmute.
Yes, I realise that. I take no offence at all.
Good.
I wanted to ask about what is in many ways a footnote, I suppose, to the French Revolution, but an important one nonetheless, which is the emancipation of the Jews, because in 1789, I understand the Constituent Assembly did just that. And the famous words of Count Clermont Tonnerre, if I can pronounce it correctly, who said, to the Jews as individuals, everything; to the Jews as a nation, nothing. Can you comment on the background to that? And in particular, I asked, France was a Catholic state up to then, so presumably the French, the Assembly, specifically rejected the idea that the states should belong to a particular religious ethnic group. And that has implications today, because of course that's exactly what the Israeli state is. The second question I wanted to ask was, the French Revolution took place with the uprising in Haiti, San Domingo, taking place. And it granted abolition of slavery, I believe, but then took it back because Napoleon reinstituted it. So again, if you could comment on just some of those, because that was historically extremely important as well. And I mean, France fought a battle, a war with San Domingo. That's it.
Interesting. Okay, Kevin, please.
Okay. On the question of the emancipation of Jews, I think the definition of nation is an interesting one, partly because the idea of the nation in this period is starting to form, and in particular the idea of the nation as being the people. For example, that the people, the state, and the nation are all essentially the same. So, you know, whether the king is the king of France or the king of the French people, which again has a, you know, a sort of democratic, you know, conception behind it. So when the phrase is there about, you know, for Jewish people individually, I think that the Jews are seen as a group. They're seen obviously as a religious group, I think that their conception as a nation is very different from a modern conception. And I think that what the law is attempting to do is to remove the civil disabilities that fall upon the Jewish people as essentially French people or French citizens. In other words, they're being integrated into French society as citizens. And so the separation of church and state and the idea of the private conscience is emerging there. In terms of the religious background, well, the French monarchy was Catholic, obviously, and the majority of French people would have been raised as Catholics, although the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment traditions, and indeed the criticisms of clerical power, and indeed the rational criticisms or claims of Christianity by people like Voltaire, Diderot, and so on, would have meant that there was a considerable degree of skepticism. So in calling France a Catholic country, I think is, it's true, but large numbers of people would have been, I think, quite secular, certainly in comparison, with other countries, and certainly in comparison with the countries further over into Eastern and Central Europe. Also, large numbers of people active in politics were from a Huguenot Protestant background, and again, the tradition there of skepticism and so on was actually quite strong. Obviously, the disabilities on Jewish people were quite general, and France was the first country, I think, to remove them. Remember that in Britain, these disabilities are not removed till much later in the 19th century, and even informal disabilities, lasted a lot longer. But I think Tony's question about how Jewish people saw themselves, and indeed how they were seen, I think the use of the term nation is an interesting one, because the modern idea of nation is forming, but remember that nation is also a reference, or can be a reference, particularly in this more archaic sense, to a group of people. So that, for example, in the early modern period, people might be of the German nation, but that would refer to people who were culturally German, rather than even, subjects of the Holy Roman Empire. So I think it's trying to move towards this idea of the individual citizen, rather than the sort of block or a grouping being members of the nation. And I think, Tony, your point about Israel and indeed other societies, is a valid one in that regard. Just on the point about religion and the French Revolution, the state wasn't entirely secular. Indeed, under Robespierre, there was a strange sort of deist movement, the cult of the supreme being, and this was partly because it was thought that there was a social utility to having a religion. Voltaire had argued that, Rousseau to a certain extent had argued that God was useful for social order, that if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him in that way. Babeuf was an atheist, as indeed were many of his comrades, but a number of them were deists as well. But the social function of religion, particularly Catholic power, was very seriously challenged, so that church property was nationalized, and indeed much of the church buildings became public property. The really big confrontations between church and state actually are going to occur in the Third Republic after 1871, and in particular the conflicts over education, the secularization of education, and the clear separation of church and state. Because the Restoration does see does see the church restored to its position. I think the other point as well about the church in this period as well is it's very clearly identified with the counter-revolutionary forces. So not only does it back the monarchy in France, but it backs monarchies and the status quo across Europe. So in a way, the Catholics, as an organized political group, are clearly identified with counter-revolution. For example, in the revolt in the Vendée in modern Brittany, that often took on a sort of religious fervor, and indeed it was a fairly brutal suppression of that revolt, which was often anti-revolutionary, using the symbols of Catholicism. I'm trying to think of the name of them. They were they wore a particular color bonnet, but I can't remember what the color is. But actually, that symbol has reappeared again in Brittany, not particularly associated with Catholicism, but with a sort of anti-Macronist movement. Yeah. Someone is improving my French here by correcting it. But yes, that's that I think is important. Just on the point about Haiti, I'm going to do a separate session next week, which I'm going to talk a little more about that, Tony. There's been a very good biography just recently issued, and again, the point you make about Napoleon, and indeed the sort of turning around of that period of the revolution, I think is interesting. It represents a consolidation of the revolution, so that Napoleon does go back to some monarchical forms, but the basis of property. Yeah, the basis of property, for example, the transfers of some church property and other property and so on, are consolidated, and then on top of that, the officials and the sort of new aristocracy, often of Napoleon's family and the families of his generals, they remain in place. But of course, the reimposition of slavery, just as in other aspects of the Code Napoleon, on for example, on property transfers, and indeed on some aspects of women's rights, are examples of this sort of turn back to reaction. Not a complete restoration. Even the restoration isn't in many ways going back to the ancien regime.
Tony wanted to ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah, when I referred to people being Catholic, what I really meant was the state itself saw itself as a Catholic state.
Yes.
Just as Israel today sees itself as a Jewish state. And that was the kind of revolutionary principle, that it became a state of all the people in France, as opposed to a particular group or ethnicity. As for nation, there's an old Jewish religious concept of Le'am, the people. It isn't a nation in the sense that we understand it now, but that was how it was used at the time. I should add that all the early Zionists, in fact, not just early Zionists, hated emancipation because it opened the gates to assimilation, which is their biggest enemy. I mean, today, Zionists will often say that assimilation has taken as many people away from their people or the nation as Hitler did. That's quite a common, although extremely offensive expression. But France was, Britain had emancipation in 1858 and Germany in 1871. So it was 80 years ahead of the curve, as it were, in France, which itself I think is quite interesting. I don't think I have anything else. No, that's fine. They were the points, if you wanted to comment on them.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And I don't.
Oh, whoops! I'm sorry, I've thrown Kevin out. Oops. So sorry. Hold on a second. I'll bring him back. Where is he? Sorry, Kevin. Wrong button. He'll be with us shortly.
These things happen.
And they do.
He's muted still, Kevin.
Sorry, Kevin, can you hear us? I'm so sorry, Kevin. I don't know what happened. Wrong button.
Yeah.
Are you trying to get a job for the Labour Party NEC by muting?
yeah, if I chance. Sorry.
Just one point to follow up on Tony, and I was going to say it would be a very good idea, maybe for Tony or for some other comrades, to talk about the history of the various aspects of Zionism, but also the Jewish population in Europe, because as an impact of the French Revolution, certainly in Germany, there is then a debate about this whole idea of whether Jews should assimilate, but the whole idea of the modern Jew, what it meant to be Jewish. And I remember, I think I was in the Jewish Museum in Prague, seeing various pamphlets and discussions that were going on with, I think the Mendelssohn family, there's quite a whole wide range of them, but it was very clear that they were looking at the French Revolution, and that this possibility of emancipation then throws up the question about what sort of people we are in this type of society. So I think it would be very good, Tony, if we could get something together. But anyway, thanks for that comment. It's very useful.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Tony. We have one more question in the chat, which I'm going to read out quickly, from Liv. How widespread was knowledge of the French Revolution amongst the masses in Britain at that time, late 18th and early 19th century? Most would have been illiterate, wouldn't have they been in that period? Would they know about what was going on?
Yes, they would. And we know about this because again, of newspapers, and perhaps more importantly, the British state kept records. It had spies, and it kept a very close watch on what was happening. Liv, if you want to follow this up, and again, it's an excellent book, and although it's a fairly thick one, look at E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, in which he refers to people in all parts of the country discussing, politics in France and elsewhere. And this, people followed these things avidly. Again, I always remember reading, it's not particularly about France, but Thompson describes somebody in their autobiography, written admittedly in the 1840s, describing walking across the hills. It's actually not far from, it's those hills in Penistone towards Sheffield. And he says, my companions and I were out for a stroll, and we were discussing the latest happenings in Brazil. And that, of course, is an independence movement in Brazil. So I think people were aware of what was happening throughout the world. There were newspapers, not only radical newspapers. The Black Dwarf is a radical newspaper of this period, admittedly in the years after the French Revolution, but also the standard newspapers. Now, large numbers of people were illiterate, but a surprising number of people were not illiterate. There's actually a lot of self-education, and often churches and other groups are teaching people to read. And that's a great idea, providing they read the right stuff, as long as they stick to their Bible and do as they're told. But of course, once you teach people to read, they can start reading all sorts of things. One thing we do know, going back more specifically to the 1790s, is that people in Britain knew about events across the Channel. I think, Liv, you come from Brighton, or you live in Brighton, so you know how close it is. And, people were coming and going, and they were bringing news. There was trade and so on. But also, if you couldn't read or you couldn't afford to buy the newspapers, people chipped in together. They paid people to read to them. So in pubs and clubs and coffee houses and in all sorts of places, people had the news read out to them. So I think there was quite widespread knowledge. And of course, from 1793, with Britain's involvement in the counter-revolutionary wars, then people were dying or people were getting involved in the fighting. And of course, in 1797, we have the famous mutinies of British sailors at Spithead, in modern Portsmouth, and then in the Nore on the Thames and Medway, where they mutinied and they ran up the red flag and declared what they called the Floating Republic. So I think there was quite widespread knowledge. Again, there was sufficiently widespread knowledge for the ruling class to be afraid. And you know, if you read Thompson, I think it's an excellent account of what people knew and how people were following politics. Because of course they didn't have the right to vote themselves, and when they saw people overthrowing tyrants in other countries, and they took inspiration from that. You know, we're at the beginnings of the modern world. You know, news can travel quite quickly, and you know, that I think is a great lesson to us. You know, and you know, people I think were thirsting to know what was happening in their world. Yeah, that's my comment.
Right. Okay, we have one more contribution. It's Anne. If you could switch on your video, unless you want to be just heard and not seen. No, there she is. Hello.
Okay. Hi. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. I very much enjoyed that talk. One issue I want to raise, and sorry if I've missed it. I was walking the dog with the listening to it, and maybe you cut out a couple of times on me, but I don't think you did deal with the issue of women's involvement in the movement, because from what I understand, although, you know, the language of the time is about men and men's rights, and, you know, everything is women. The question, the word woman, as far as I know, doesn't enter into the language of the revolution. But nevertheless, there were very many women involved in it, or at least some women involved in it, in the sans-culottes. And I just wondered, you know, I think it would be useful if you said something about that, because I think that was a question which emerged in that revolution in a way that hadn't ever really emerged before. That's, to my understanding, it became an issue because of the, I suppose, proletarian nature of the revolution, brought women who were working onto the streets of Paris and as enthusiastic participants in the revolution. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yes, and my apologies. I perhaps should have mentioned that, because I think it is often highlighted that Babeuf in particular was, you know, was an advocate of universal suffrage, not just male suffrage. And indeed, there were a number of women involved. Though, you know, not only, I think, were they involved in the, you know, the various organizational aspects, but actually as speakers and so on. In fact, there were a number of female defendants in the trial. So yes, I think that is important. I think part of the wider point, though, is that in revolutionary movements, you know, of whatever nature, and I mean, Steve and John, you know, would testify to this in reference to England, is of course all sorts of social relations and traditions are called into question. And one of the interesting things that does combine the economic with, I suppose, the social and the patriarchal, is that in Paris, although there is proletarian employment, you know, factory employment, there are also smaller workshops, and indeed there are forms of family production very similar to what in Britain would be called domestic work. By that I mean production going on in the household, so that the family was as often as much an economic unit in which there would be, say, small artisan production in which all members of the family would be involved. So the woman's role was economic, but it was very much within the framework of the family. And that would have been, I think, you know, a significant element. So when when the Jacobins and others are talking about the sans-culotte and they're talking about the sort of basic unit, they're often talking about a family unit of production. And that again is very similar to the sort of situation that we might have in the 17th century in Britain or in England. So one of the points then would be that when a revolution occurs, all sorts of relationships are thrown into doubt. And for example, giving people the right to vote, you then ask the question, what is the basis that you're given the right to vote? Is it because you're independent, you're a citizen, you're economically independent, in other words, in this sort of family unit? And what about the dependents? You know, the Levellers had this question, and indeed it was to last all the way through the development of the suffrage in the 19th century. You know, who has the right to vote? Can you have the right to vote if you're a wage labourer because you're dependent on people? So these relationships are often called into question in that way. Women were domestic servants, you know, and there was in that way, but many more of them also worked within the family, within a family production unit, and we often sort of overlook that because we often think of industrial and other forms of employment as being male. But if we think of much work going on in the home, and as I've said, if you think of the textile industry as it emerges in the 16th and 17th century in northern England, with framework knitting and so on, that's often going on in houses, you know, in the third story of the house, and you know, women will be working at that as much as men. So women are drawn into production, and then they're drawn into politics. And you know, the work of people like Mary Wollstonecraft and others in this period is all very important. Yeah, Daniel Lazar has reminded me of the Women's March out to Versailles to go and see the baker and his son and the baker's boy, which was a very bad pun on the French royal family's name. But yes, women were quite important in some of these great days of the French Revolution. So thank you, Daniel, for reminding me of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. We have two more questions, but I'm aware that it's actually sort of now time almost to go. But I wonder if I read them out, you might incorporate them into your summing up, if that's at all possible. Liz is asking, can you explain the role of the printing press and leafleting as regards sharing revolutionary ideas and getting revolutionaries together from all over France, like peasants and others? Ben is asking, he was out jogging while you were talking, that some of the most recognizable socialist ideas were forming in this period. Could you just mention them again when you're summing up?
Okay, thanks. Well, my summing up will be brief enough. You know, I don't want to stop people from jogging. First of all, about the printing press and leaflets and newspapers as well. Yes, they're very important, and I think they again move us towards a sort of recognizably modern form of politics, in that these are appeals to the population to do something, to believe something, to support something. So they're clearly mass. And if I go back to the fly posting, this isn't just a poster which says, you know, vote Babeuf. It's actually effectively a sort of newspaper stuck on the wall. And again, we have accounts of wars being covered in various posters in that way. I mean, that's still a tradition in many parts of Europe. You know, so that, you know, that is clearly very significant. In terms of going out into the countryside, I think that's less so. But one interesting thing that Babeuf actually did in the early days of the revolution in Picardy was to produce a newspaper which he sent around to priests and indeed other opinion formers, to use the modern term, and so forth, So there was an attempt in a way to go beyond just the purely educated and the elite in that way. Remember that newspapers could be quite expensive, and Babeuf and others deliberately made them cheaper, and indeed made them to be, distributed, much more widely in that way. We've got a lot of this material around, and indeed the sources for the French Revolution are excellent. Many of them are state sources where they seized the material and then used it as evidence. Indeed, for some other revolutionary movements other than Babeuf, because the French state had a system of registrations, we can actually trace the movement of revolutionaries across the French Empire, because people had to have these residence cards, and they're actually still available. One of my colleagues, a very eminent professor of French history, she was able to trace a number of oppositionists, particularly the United Irishmen, across Europe by going to the National Archive in Paris and looking at the cards, and being a truly bureaucratic state, they kept that information, including the signatures. So if you can imagine, every time you register in a hotel in France or anywhere else, that material was kept and provides good information. But we've got quite a lot of the material, so we've got a good idea of what was said and was done in this period. I think it was Ben's last point on socialist ideas. What I was trying to do at the beginning was to sort of point out that the French Revolution in many ways does bring into existence many of our modern conceptions of politics, and that ideas of left and right, popular sovereignty, equality, liberty, fraternity, all of those words, these are all, still shape the way that we look at things. And I suppose why Babeuf and others like him are important is that they pick up on what were ideas of not necessarily an elite, but ideas of the middle class and the literate and the educated from the Enlightenment, and they extend them in reaction to the events of the revolution. So this is not somebody sitting in a book-lined study and saying, I think I'll dream up a proposal for an ideal society. These are people who've got basic principles, and they've seen the way that the Jacobin government operated. They've seen the social and economic problems that exist in France. They've seen that the revolution, which they believed was going to institute equality, was going to introduce common happiness, the commonwealth. They believed that this is what could have occurred, and they'd seen how far and then no further. And so they were working on this as a practical problem. They were like, comrades may remember a debate we had much earlier with, I think, Pat Byrne and Ben Lewis, talking about Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartakists in Germany. These are people who are in the middle of a revolution, who've got basic principles. They want to achieve things, and they're then working on this in a sense in real time. And they'd seen the sort of forces that the revolution had thrown up. They've seen the forces above all of the population, and the ability of the mass of the population, certainly in Paris, to impose themselves on the revolution at key moments, whether it be intervening at Versailles or in the Hôtel de Ville or wherever. And this is, I think, very important about the role of the working class, and of course of the sans-culottes as well. But also it's taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and giving them a political form, so that when Rousseau talks about natural rights and he talks about people being born free, well, Babeuf extends that and says they're born free, they're in chains, so let's think of how we can release the chains, and let's think about a society that we want to build. He'd had practical experience of working in food administration. He knew you know, he knew the needs of the population in that way. He knew that he knew what people required, but he also knew the way that private property, you know, blocked that. So how do we abolish private property? And even, I suppose, practical political problems, one which all of us as socialists have grappled with, is that if we live in a society in which ideas of property and so on are deeply embedded, then how do we get people to overcome and transform their consciousness? And Babeuf was very keen on trying to develop that. Could people, for example, develop a new form of consciousness? And if they did, how was that going to be done? Who would do it? Would it be done through a sort of a dictatorial regime that would impose this? Or would it be through education? Would people be able to reason and think and develop these ideas themselves? And these were the practical problems which they were considering about their transitional regime. And for those comrades who've studied the Russian Revolution, you know, for example, ideas about the liberation of women, or about changing attitudes towards children and education, you'll see that all revolutionaries grapple with these problems, and also all revolutionaries grapple with the problem of how do you convince the mass of the population of the possibilities of socialist change. And these problems, I think, are all here in embryo in the work of Babeuf and his comrades. So I think that's their contribution to socialism. They're both an inspiration in what they did and what they thought, but they're also in some ways, you know, our comrades in going over these problems, and they help us to see the way that people were first grappling with them, and in that sense, both a guide and an inspiration. So that's it.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think that was one of my favorite sessions so far. I think you really managed to bring this period alive and teach us something from a different angle on the French Revolution, just as I expected. Well done, Kevin.